Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
In July 1954, a man arrives at Tokyo Airport in Japan. He's of Caucasian appearance and conventional looking. But the officials are suspicious. On checking his passport, they see that he hails from a country called Taured. The passport looked genuine, except for the fact that there is no such country as Taured. The man is interrogated and asked to point out where his country supposedly exists on a map. He immediately points his finger towards the Principality of Andorra, but becomes angry and confused. He's never heard of Andorra, and can't understand why his homeland of Taured isn't there. According to him, it should have been, for it had existed for more than 1,000 years. Customs officials found him in possession of money from several different European currencies. His passport had been stamped by many airports around the globe, including previous visits to Tokyo. Baffled, they took him to a local hotel and placed him in a room with 2 guards outside until they could get to the bottom of the mystery. The company he claimed to work for had no knowledge of him, although he had copious amounts of documentation to prove his point. The hotel he claimed to have a reservation for had never heard of him either. The company officials in Tokyo he was there to do business with? Yup, you've guessed it, they just shook their heads too. Later, when the hotel room he was held in was opened, the man had disappeared. The police established that he could not have escaped out of the window. The room was several floors up, and there was no balcony. He was never seen again, and the mystery was never solved. There is an intriguing theory that the man may have hailed from an alternative universe, a world almost the same as ours, but not quite. His world, unlike ours, contained a country called Taured.
Pardon the interruption. This mystery has been solved recently. The man's name was John Allen Zegras. Please check the links in the description for more details into the case.
A similar incident occurred in 1851 when a man calling himself Joseph Vorin was found wandering in the German village of Frankfurt an der Oder. When the German authorities asked the man where he was from, Vorin told them that he was from Laxaria, a country on the continent of Sacria. This baffled the authorities because neither of the places existed anywhere on their map of the world. One of the best documented reports of a possible visitant from another world landing in Earth came from the little French town of Alencon, which is situated about 30 miles north of Le Mans. The town is nowadays solely famous because of its fine lace, but over 200 years ago, Alencon became renowned for something much less mundane that occurred within its vicinity. At around 5 a.m. on June 12, 1790, peasants watched in awe as a huge metal sphere descended from the sky, moving with a strange undulating motion. The globe crash landed onto a hilltop, and the violent impact threw up soil and vegetation which showered the hillside. The hull of the globe was so hot, possibly from a rocket motor or because of the rapid descent through the atmosphere, that it ignited the surrounding dry flora, and a grass fire quickly broke out. The peasants rushed up the hill carrying pails of water, and within a short time, the fires were extinguished. A large crowd encircled the crashed globe, and some of the more adventurous people present stepped forward to touch the hull of the unearthly craft to discover that it was quite warm. A physician, 2 mayors from nearby towns and a number of officials turned up to see what had descended from the morning sky, and these important witnesses arrived just in time to see something sensational. A hatch of some sort slid open in the lower hemisphere of the globe, and a man in an outlandish, tight-fitting costume emerged through the hatchway and surveyed the observers with an apprehensive look. He started mumbling something in a strange language and gestured for the crowd to get away from him and his vehicle. A few people stepped back, and the man ran through the break in the circle of spectators and fled into the local woods. Some of the peasants ran away from the globe, sensing that something dangerous was about to happen. The remainder of the crowd decided to follow suit, and seconds after the last members of the multitude had retreated from the sphere, it exploded with a peculiar muffled sound, creating a miniature mushroom-shaped cloud. The debris from the craft sizzled in the grass and gradually turned to powder. A police inspector named Abbeville traveled over 100 miles from Paris to investigate the crash, and he quizzed many of the witnesses, including the mayors and physician who had been present at the strange spectacle. The inspector organized a thorough search of the woods where the oddly dressed man had taken refuge, but the hunt resulted in nothing. Their stranger seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as he had arrived. In the report to his superiors, Inspector Abbeville put forward the suggestion that the man who had landed in the globe could have been a being from another world, but the high-ups in Paris dismissed the intimation as a ludicrous idea. The Moberly-Jourdain incident, or the Ghosts of Petit Trianon or Versailles, was an event that occurred on 10 August 1901 in the gardens of the Petit Trianon, involving two female academics, Charlotte Ann Moberly, 1846–1937, and Eleanor Jourdain, 1863–1924. In August of 1901, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain decided to visit the Palace of Versailles in France. As they were not impressed with the palace after touring it, they decided to walk through the gardens to the Petit Trianon. On the way, however, they learned that they were closed to the public that day and, instead, decided to explore the grounds some more. Soon, the two ladies were lost and, as they put it, overcome with a feeling of weariness and oppression. Soon, they began to notice things that were out of place. Dignified officials in three-cornered hats, an old plow and farmhouse, and other people and things that appeared as though they belonged more in a wax museum than the streets of 20th-century Paris. They reached the edge of a wood, close to the Temple de l'Amour, and came across a man seated beside a garden kiosk, wearing a cloak and large shady hat. According to Moberly, his appearance was most repulsive, its expression odious. His complexion was dark and rough. Jourdain noted, the man slowly turned his face, which was marked by smallpox. His complexion was very dark. The expression was evil and yet unseeing, and though I did not feel that he was looking particularly at us, I felt a repugnance to going past him. A man later described as tall, with large dark eyes and crisp curling black hair under a large sombrero hat, came up to them and showed them the way to the Petit Trianon. After crossing a bridge, they reached the gardens in front of the palace, and Moberly noticed a lady sketching on the grass who looked at them. She later described what she saw in great detail. The lady was wearing a light summer dress, on her head was a shady white hat, and she had lots of fair hair. Moberly thought she was a tourist at first, but the dress appeared to be old-fashioned. Moberly came to believe that the lady was Marie Antoinette. Jourdain, however, did not see the lady. After this, they were directed round to the entrance and joined a party of other visitors. The strange feelings and visions of the past had vanished. It was many months before the women told of their strange encounters. Visiting Versailles sometime later, the women were not able to find the landmarks that they had noticed during the incident. During their research, they thought they recognized the man by the kiosk as the Comte de Vaudreuil, a friend of Marie Antoinette, who herself had been thought to have been seen by Moberly. The two women eventually wrote a book called An Adventure in 1911, but their identities as the authors were not revealed until 1931, 4 years after Eleanor Jourdain passed away. A widely publicized case from October 1979 concerned the Simpsons and the Gisbys, two English married couples driving through France en route to a holiday in Spain. Bedding in somewhat basic rooms, they were a little unnerved to discover no glass in any of the building's windows, only wooden shutters that closed from the outside. It wasn't just the building though, all the people they met, Everyone from police officers to locals seemed strangely old-fashioned too, dressing almost as if they had just stepped out of the 19th century. In fact, everything, even the knives and forks everybody ate with, seemed outdated. Not being able to speak much French, the English couples couldn't ask about it. Putting all the strange anachronisms down to simply being in rural France and impressed by the mere 18 francs their stay had cost them, the four decided to look for the same hotel again on their return journey. However, this time, despite searching for several hours, they were unable to find it again. What more, when they returned home, they were puzzled when all the photos they had taken there turned out blank. As if the hotel and its inhabitants had somehow simply vanished, disappearing even from their film negatives. If Simpsons and the Gisbys really did, as it seems, travel back in time about 100 years or so though, why did their hosts accept 1970s-style currency? Assuming the foursome didn't just invent their story, though why would they? It would seem to suggest there could be a lot more to this type of experience than one might first imagine. Any serious student of the paranormal, of course, could come up with a whole range of incredible suggestions. Perhaps we're dealing with godlike tricksters playing games with mortal men for their own childish amusement? However, before we begin to speculate, perhaps it would be wise to briefly consider another well-known case first. There are plenty to choose from, but easily the most credible involved no less than the great philosopher and psychiatrist Carl Jung. According to the famous thinker, while traveling through Italy in the 1930s, he visited the tomb of a Roman empress in Ravenna. Impressed with the remarkable beauty of the mosaics depicting maritime scenes in an eerily pale blue light, he discussed them with his companion for about half an hour and, on leaving the mausoleum, even tried to purchase postcards of them. Surprisingly, though, there weren't any. Sometime later, Jung asked a friend visiting Ravenna if he could obtain pictures for him. It was only after seeing them that he finally learned the truth. The mosaics he had seen and discussed in great detail were totally different to the mosaics now decorating the mausoleum. However, they did exist once but had been destroyed in a fire some 700 years previously. So what is going on? Jung was personally convinced that his consciousness had somehow traveled back in time to when the mausoleum had been first constructed, 1,400 years prior to his visit to Ravenna. As discussed earlier, time travel is thought by scientists to only be possible in the most extreme of circumstances. However, what if the laws that govern nature are different to the laws that govern the mind? If so, then maybe it would be possible for consciousness, free of the limitations of the laws of physics, to travel through time much more easily. Further, many timeslip witnesses report strange bouts of depression or unease just prior to or at the start of their experience. Perhaps this indicates that the mind is indeed involved in some key way. The theory would definitely explain why the Simpsons and the Gisbys weren't able to get any photographs. Which brings us back to the question of why their French hosts didn't make a fuss about their modern money. Maybe they simply saw money from their own era. The following account of a possible visit to another dimension in time or space was forwarded to this author by Dr. Raúl Ríos Centeno, an investigator of the unexplained in Lima, Peru. Several months ago, begins his fascinating narration, a patient came to see me about a serious case of hemiplegia. The patient claimed to be 30 years old but was unable to prove it, stating that she'd lost her formal identification card. It was a very strange case of hemiplegia, since upon examination with a CAT, computerized axial tomography, scan, there were neither areas showing bleeding vessels nor any traumatic lesions. When I began asking questions about the case, the patient told me the following. I was at a campground in the vicinity of the ancient stone forest, Markawasi, when I went out exploring late at night with some friends. Oddly enough, we heard the strains of music and noticed a small torch-lit stone cabin. I was able to see people dancing inside, but upon getting closer I felt a sudden sensation of cold which I paid little attention to, and I stuck my head through an open door. It was then that I saw the occupants were clad in 17th century fashion. I tried to enter the room, but one of my girlfriends pulled me out. The patient was tugged out by one of her friends, and her body became paralyzed in half precisely as she was drawn out of the stone cabin. My conclusion is that the probable cause behind the hemiplegia is unknown. No medical test was able to ascertain its cause. Nonetheless, an EEG was able to show that the left hemisphere of the brain did not show signs of normal functioning, as well as an abnormal number of electric waves. Many Peruvians claim having had contact experiences in Marcahuasi, while many scholars indicate the existence of a dimensional doorway. No conclusive proof of this exists, of course. Some friends, obviously, and others who have visited the stone forest can attest to the existence of a strange kind of energy. According to those persons having knowledge of this subject, dimensional doorways tend to open and close not necessarily in specific places. The patient is currently undergoing physical rehabilitation in Lima's Arzobispo Loaiza National Hospital. The unanswered question is, of course, what would have happened if her body had entered completely into the stone cabin? Would she have gone into another dimension? I suppose the truth shall be known in the fullness of time. Dr. Rios' fascinating account was followed up with the following information concerning the CAT scan results on the anonymous patient. The test, he indicated, showed intact intracranial regions without any specific area having been compromised. There is neither swelling nor color changes which may suggest some manner of trauma. The clinician certifying this exam cannot find a justified cause for the hemiplegia in the left hemisphere, due to the fact its vascularization and irrigation fall within parameters considered to be normal. The EEG shows areas evidently paralyzed due to the lack of electric current transmission. These tests lead me to believe, and this is my personal opinion, since my colleagues have simply catalogued it as an unknown affliction, that the dimensional shift, or partial entry, of this person into this anomalous zone, have able to produce a change in the energy flow existing in her nervous system, or perhaps even a change in the type of energy. Given that the cranial area is where our nerve impulses are contained, in other words, the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body and vice versa. This could be the reason why the left-hand autonomous nervous system did not at all affect the operation of crucial organs such as the heart or the stomach, which are governed by the right cerebral hemisphere. The Sandersons were in Haiti doing a biological survey, when one evening their car got stuck on a muddy road, miles away from civilization. Luckily, their assistant, appropriately clad in white, was with them at the time, so he went ahead, while the couple walked up the road at a more leisurely pace. Walking a few steps behind his wife, Sanderson suddenly observed, much to his astonishment, there were houses along both sides of the road. Not cottages, not cabins, not huts. 3-storied houses made of stone, varied in style. In Sanderson's own words, these houses hung out over the road, which suddenly appeared to be muddy with large cobblestones. The houses were of, I would say, about the Elizabethan period of England, but for some reason I knew they were in Paris. They had pent roofs, with some dormer windows, gables, timbered porticos and small windows with tiny leaded panes. Here and there were dull reddish lights burning behind them, as if from candles. There were iron frame lanterns hanging from timbers jutting from some houses, and they were all swaying together as if in a wind, but there was not the faintest movement of the air about us. Before Sanderson, who at this stage was likely questioning his sanity, and possibly his menu of that day, could say anything, he bumped into his wife's back. She had stopped all of the sudden. Then, says Sanderson, she took his hand and stood there, wide-eyed and speechless, and then, pointing towards the edge of the road, she said, "How did we get to Paris 500 years ago?" Sanderson's wife also saw the buildings, but the third member of their party, a man named Frederick Alsop, who was walking ahead of them, did not. We stood marveling at what we apparently both now saw, picking out individual items and pointing, questioning each other as to details, etc. Curiously, we found ourselves swaying back and forth and began to feel very weak, so I called out to Fred, whose white shirt was fast disappearing ahead. When Alsop ran back to join them, the apparition vanished, and there was nothing before me but the endless and damned thorn bushes and cactus and bare earth. Sanderson thought the experience might have been some kind of shared hallucination, possibly brought on by exhaustion. If two people can see the same, non-existent thing, how many more could? Does one have to have the very close rapport of a devoted husband and wife, or can mere confraternity be enough? I don't know, but I'd sure like to find out. In 1932, German newspaper reporter J. Bernard Hutton and his colleague, photographer Joachim Brandt, were assigned to do a story on the Hamburg-Altona shipyards. After being given a tour by a shipyard executive, the two newspapermen were leaving when they heard the drone of overhead aircraft. They at first thought it was a practice drill, but that notion was quickly dispelled when bombs began exploding all around and the roar of anti-aircraft gunfire filled the air. The sky quickly darkened, and they were in the middle of a full-blown air raid. They quickly got in their car and drove away from the shipyard back toward Hamburg. As they left the area, however, the sky seemed to brighten and they again found themselves in the light of a calm, ordinary late afternoon. They looked back at the shipyards, and there was no destruction, no bomb-induced inferno they had just left, no aircraft in the sky. The photos Brandt had taken during the attack showed nothing unusual. It wasn't until 1943 that the British Royal Air Force attacked and destroyed the shipyard, just as Hutton and Brandt had experienced it 11 years earlier. In October 1969, a man identified only as LC and his business associate, Charlie, were driving north from Abbeville, Louisiana toward Lafayette on Highway 167. The highway had been practically traffic-free until they spotted some distance ahead what appeared to be an old turtleback-type auto traveling very slowly. While the style of the auto indicated it to be decades old, it appeared to be in showroom condition. Because the car was traveling so slowly, the two men decided to pass it, but before doing so, slowed to better appreciate the beauty and mint condition of the vehicle. As they did so, LC noticed a very large bright orange license plate with the year 1940 clearly printed on it. They also noticed the driver of the car was a young woman dressed in what appeared to be 1940 vintage clothing. Their study turned to alarm as their attention was riveted to the animated expressions of fear and panic on the woman's face. They could see her frantically looking back and forth as if lost or in need of help. Being on the passenger's side, LC called out to her and asked if she needed help. To this she nodded, yes, all the while looking down with a very puzzled look at their vehicle. They saw her begin to pull over, so they continued to pass her so as to safely pull over also in front of her. As they came to a halt on the shoulder of the road, LC and Charlie turned to look at the old car behind them. However, to their astonishment, there was no sign of the car. Remember, this was on an open highway with no side roads nearby, no place to hide a car. It and its occupants had simply vanished. Moments later, another car pulled up to the businessmen and, quite puzzled, said he had seen their car pull off to the side. His account was as follows. He was driving north on Highway 167 when he saw, some distance away, a new car passing up a very old car at a slow pace, so slow that they appeared to be nearly stopped. He saw the new car pull onto the shoulder and the old car started to do the same. Momentarily, it obstructed the new car and then suddenly disappeared. In August 1999, Kim and her husband had a weird experience near Laughlin, Nevada. Instead of their trip taking a far shorter time than it should have, it took inexplicably longer. I was following my husband home from Las Vegas to Kingman, near Laughlin, Kim says. He was on his Harley and I was following in my car. We had made this trip several times before and knew exactly how long it took to reach home from the Hoover Dam, 1.5 hours. The weirdness began with their perception of the weather. My husband swears it was raining in the distance and lightning was so close he could almost feel the electricity, Kim says. I swear it was dry as a bone. Also, I had a hard time keeping up as he was going very fast around the corners. I could see him in the distance, and suddenly there were a lot of cars ahead of me and behind him. I thought that was odd since there was a mountain up one side and a sheer cliff down the other. There was nowhere for those cars to have come from. Oddly enough, as soon as I thought that was weird for them to be there, they were gone. It seemed as though the trip was taking forever, and I was getting really tired. When we arrived home, I thought it was really late and so did my husband. We looked at the clock and the 1.5 hour trip had taken over 4 hours. We are afraid of what happened to us during that missing time.
When I was younger, my family went on a camping trip. We weren't roughing it or anything. The campsite had electricity, a pool, and a shop with ice cream. We basically called it camping because we slept in a tent. On the second day of our adventure, I woke up in my Superman sleeping bag in the middle of very thick woods. Confused, I sat there for hours. My mother always told that if I was lost that I should hold still. Eventually, I saw a dim light in the distance. I ran toward it. A small white cabin with vines growing up the side and strange yellow bushes growing out front stood in a small clearing. I knocked on the front door and was greeted by a middle-aged man with graying red hair and dirty tan pants. He was stunned that I was there. He ushered me in and asked if I was hurt. I told him I was fine and I had lost my parents. When he asked what my name was, I realized just how strange things were. For the sake of the story, I'll tell you my name is Alexander. He couldn't pronounce my name at all. The X sound came out as I repeated my name several times and told him it was the letter X, not K. He told me not to play games. I told him I wasn't, that was my name. He said no letter in the English language sounded like that. I was growing very annoyed and so was he. He asked where I was from. I told him the city. He didn't recognize the name. He pulled out a map and asked me to point it out. Years later, in school we learned about Pangea and I realized that was the map he gave me. I started crying after minutes of trying to read the map. Some letters looked like R's, while others looked like squiggles. He told me not to worry and he'd take me to the closest town tomorrow. I asked him what his name was and he said something I couldn't even try to translate. He almost made a gurgling sound. The rest of the night was uneventful. He made me a very bitter tea and asked me about my life. Where I went to school, what my parents did, and so on. Everything seemed almost normal after a while. He let me sleep on his bed while he took the couch. I shut my eyes and all I could feel was the rush of water into my lungs. I kicked my legs and arms frantically. I broke the surface of the pool, freezing cold in the middle of the night. I ran to my campsite crying and jumped into my parents' bed soaking wet. They hadn't noticed my absence, though I was sure I had been gone for at least a day. They calmed me down and told me to sleep with them that night. I searched every corner of that campsite in the morning. The sleeping bag I had left on the woods was nowhere to be seen.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.